He lost his farm, his wife, and nearly his son's hope, until an inheritance no one wanted changed everything. A ruined peach orchard and an old chestnut horse seemed worthless, but in the silence of the valley, hoofprints led to secrets buried for decades. What the horse uncovered would test a father's courage, expose powerful enemies, and give a dying orchard one last chance to bloom. The sun in California's Central Valley had a way of bleaching everything: wood, stone, even memory. That summer, the earth lay cracked like old porcelain, and dust rose in restless swirls with every faint gust. John Miller, 45, pushed open the door of the attorney's office in town, a place that smelled of stale paper and forgotten promises. His boots left faint marks across the tile as he picked up a sealed envelope left in his name. When he tore it open, a single sheet trembled in his calloused hands. He had inherited a ruined peach orchard and an old chestnut horse from an uncle he barely remembered. No money, no reprieve, no miracle. Only land that had stopped breathing years ago, and an animal too old to be useful. John let the letter fall onto the desk, staring at the lines as though they had been written to mock him. His life had already collapsed under debts from the failed almond farm. His wife had gone back east, and his teenage son Ethan, pale from a heart condition, needed more care than John could afford. A ruined orchard and a horse with rust-colored hair seemed like the cruelest joke fate could design. He drove out later that day, his truck rattling along the brittle road toward the edge of the valley. Fields on both sides sagged under the drought, trees gray, leaves curled like fists. When he reached the boundary fence of the property, the gate leaned on a hinge, red with rust, as though it had been waiting for decades without company. John stepped through, the air thick with the resinous scent of scorched peach wood. He could hear the buzz of insects, nothing more. And then, from the shadow of the weather-beaten barn, a figure shifted. The horse. The animal was taller than John expected, ribs faintly visible, but its coat was a deep chestnut that still caught fire in the slant of evening light. The mane, darker at the roots, fell across its brow where a faint, star-shaped marking glowed like the last coal in a dying fire. Its eyes, wide and brown, met John's without blinking. For a long moment, John stood frozen. He had expected a burden, something he could sell, maybe even put down if it came to that. What he found instead was a gaze so steady that he felt the weight of it pressing into the hollow places inside him. "Rusty," he muttered, recalling the name scribbled in the attorney's note. The horse flicked an ear, as though it had heard that sound 100 times before, and had been waiting to hear it again. John's hand hovered over the fence post, not daring to cross into the shadow. He could feel the dry wind, lifting the brim of his cap, could smell the coppery tang of dust that seemed to live on this land. Behind him, the road hummed with silence, and for the first time in a long while, he wondered if there was still something left to lose. Rusty took one step forward, the faint thud of his hoof echoing through the dead orchard like a heartbeat. John whispered, half to himself, half to the evening air, "Guess it's just you and me now." And from the barn door, where light met shadow, the horse exhaled, long and slow, as if answering a truth John had not yet learned to speak. The morning sun slid over the valley, pale and dusty, casting long shadows through the orchard rows that looked more like a graveyard than farmland. John's truck pulled to a stop by the leaning fence, and from the passenger seat, Ethan eased himself out carefully, his breath short, but eyes sharp with curiosity. The boy wore his old baseball cap, its brim frayed from years of use, pulled low over hair too thin from long months in and out of hospitals. "Stay close," John said, his voice rough with caution, though he didn't know if he was warning his son about the brittle boards of the barn or about the chestnut horse waiting inside. Rusty stood just beyond the doorway, his coat catching flecks of sun like copper buried under dust. He was still, head lifted slightly, watching the boy with a patience that unsettled John. Horses were supposed to shy away, to stamp and snort. Rusty simply breathed, slow and deliberate, as though the land had taught him that silence outlasts all storms. Ethan shuffled closer, his sneakers scuffing dry soil, and reached a thin hand forward. John wanted to stop him, wanted to say it wasn't safe. This horse was old, unpredictable, a stranger. But the words caught in his throat as he watched his son's fingers hover in the air, trembling with effort. Rusty lowered his head, inch by inch, until his muzzle brushed against the boy's hand. The sound that followed was not a whinny or a stamp, only the faint release of breath. Warm, steady, grounding. Ethan's face broke into a smile John hadn't seen in months, wide and unguarded, as if pain had been peeled back for one suspended instant. John leaned against the fence post, his chest tightening. It wasn't just relief at seeing his son connect. It was the realization that Rusty had chosen to meet him halfway. The orchard around them remained lifeless, branches brittle and gray. But inside that quiet moment, something fragile and living stirred. "You see that, Dad?" Ethan whispered, his voice nearly lost to the cicadas. "He's not afraid." John swallowed, unable to answer. He thought of the unpaid bills stacked on the kitchen table, of the foreclosure notices, of the doctor's estimates that sounded more like death sentences than medical reports. And yet here was his son, touching a horse with a heart steady enough to quiet a storm. Rusty lifted his head and nudged the boy's cap, knocking it askew. Ethan laughed, the sound startling birds from the fence line. John caught himself smiling too, though he didn't know how long it had been since he'd felt the muscles move that way. They walked back to the truck together, Ethan humming softly under his breath, the orchard stretching behind them in rows of sorrowful trees. Rusty remained at the barn door, ears tilted forward, eyes following until the boy turned and waved. The horse dipped his head in what looked almost like acknowledgement. As John started the engine, he glanced at his son, and then at the horse in the mirror. The orchard was still dying, the bank was still circling, and Ethan's condition still carried a weight John could barely shoulder. But something had shifted, just slightly, like the first crack in dry earth before rain. Ethan held on to that moment as if it were medicine, and John found himself wondering if perhaps, against all odds, it might be. The first night John and Ethan stayed on the orchard was restless. The house, a weather-beaten structure with peeling white paint and windows that rattled when the wind shifted, felt more like a forgotten outpost than a home. The floors creaked with every step, the walls smelled faintly of mildew, and the air carried the ache of years without laughter. John spread a blanket across the worn couch while Ethan took the small bedroom nearest the kitchen. For hours, silence pressed down on them like an extra layer of heat. Sometime after midnight, John stirred awake. He wasn't sure what pulled him from sleep, the hush outside, the steady tick of the clock, or the faint scrape that rose through the floorboards. He sat up, heart thudding, listening. There it was again, a muffled thud, then another. He pulled on his boots and stepped out into the night. The orchard under moonlight looked stranger than it had during the day. Rows of trees stood like crooked soldiers, their branches bare silhouettes against the pale sky. The air was cooler, tinged with the faint sweetness of fruit, long gone. Out beyond the barn, the sound returned, the rhythm of hooves striking dirt. Rusty was moving across the field, slow but deliberate, his chestnut coat gleaming silver under the moon. His head was low, ears pricked forward as though listening to something beneath the earth itself. John followed, each step crunching dry soil, his breath visible in the cool air. The horse stopped suddenly and pawed at the ground. John crouched, running his hand over the disturbed patch of dirt. It felt firmer, different from the surrounding soil. He pressed harder, and the hollow echo beneath startled him. His pulse raced. There was something under there, something his uncle had left behind. Rusty blew through his nostrils, impatient, and pawed again, the sound sharp against the stillness. "Easy, boy," John whispered, his voice catching. The horse stilled, but his eyes never left the ground. They gleamed with a strange persistence, as though he understood more than any animal should. The next morning, John brought Ethan out to see. The boy knelt beside the patch Rusty had uncovered, his small hands tracing the shallow grooves. "Dad, it's like he's showing us something," he said. His voice carried both awe and certainty. John didn't answer, not immediately. He glanced at the horse, standing tall nearby, his chestnut coat now warm in the rising sun. "Maybe he is," John said finally, though the words felt dangerous. He didn't want Ethan to hope for more than what was real, and yet he couldn't shake the echo of hooves in the night, the way Rusty's stare had rooted him to the spot. That day, John borrowed a spade from the shed and returned to the site. The soil was stubborn, baked hard by months without rain, but beneath a thin crust he struck something solid. A wooden plank, weathered but intact. He brushed away dirt, revealing the edge of what looked like an old hatch. His hands trembled as he pulled at the handle, rust flaking under his grip. The hatch groaned, releasing a draft of cool, musty air from below. Ethan leaned closer, his cap slipping back. "There's something down there, isn't there?" John hesitated, the dark opening yawning at his feet. He felt the ground tilt under the weight of it all, the debts, the sickness, the empty orchard. And now this. A secret buried, waiting for him, waiting for Rusty to reveal. The horse shifted behind him, stamping once, twice, as though urging him forward. The sound reverberated through the stillness, a steady drumbeat in the earth. John drew in a breath, the taste of dust and old wood sharp on his tongue. "Yeah," he said softly, lowering the hatch back into place for the moment. "There's something here." That night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep, John sat on the porch with a lantern burning low. Rusty stood near the fence line, his silhouette etched against the silver orchard. The horse turned his head, meeting John's eyes across the distance. And in that gaze, John felt the tug of a truth larger than himself, a reminder that some inheritances are not written on paper but carved into the soil, waiting to be uncovered by those who dare to look. The orchard lay silent again, but the hoofprints remained, pressed deep into the earth like promises. The morning came gray and heavy, the sky low with a haze that seemed to weigh down the orchard even more. John stood over the hatch he had uncovered the night before, boots planted firmly, spade in hand. Ethan lingered beside him, pale but alert, his cap pulled low against the cool air. Rusty waited a few yards away, chestnut coat catching muted light, eyes steady on them both, as if he knew this moment mattered. John pressed the spade into the soil, peeling back more dirt until the hatch groaned open. The breath that escaped from below was damp and earthy, laced with the faint tang of rusted iron. He lowered a lantern into the hole, its glow revealing a wooden ladder clinging to the wall. The rungs looked brittle, but the pull of curiosity was stronger than hesitation. He glanced back at Ethan. "Stay close, but don't come down," he said. The boy nodded, though his eyes betrayed the urge to follow. Each rung creaked under John's weight as he descended, the air cooling with every step. At the bottom, the lantern revealed a small cellar carved into earth and stone. Shelves lined the walls, cluttered with glass jars sealed in wax, papers stacked in bundles, and a few rusted tools. Dust drifted in the glow, turning the air thick and old. He moved toward a trunk in the corner, its lid warped but still fastened with a corroded latch. With a grunt, he broke it open, the sound echoing off the walls. Inside lay stacks of notebooks, each bound in leather, their pages yellowed. He lifted one carefully, thumbing through tight handwriting that described experiments with peach varieties, crossbreeds, soil treatments, notes on sweetness and resilience. They weren't just casual notes, these were careful studies, years of patient work. His uncle, the man he barely remembered, had been chasing something more than fruit. Beside the books, wrapped in cloth, were several glass bottles. John held one up to the lantern. The liquid inside was golden, thicker than water, catching the light in rich amber tones. He uncorked it slightly, inhaling a sweet, heady fragrance of fruit, honey, and something sharper, almost medicinal. He resealed it quickly, unsettled by its power even through glass. At the bottom of the trunk, pressed between books, he found a photograph. Its edges curled, its image faded but still clear enough to recognize. A younger man, his uncle, stood beside a horse. Not just any horse, but Rusty. The chestnut coat gleamed even in black and white, the same faint star marking between his eyes, the same steady presence. John stared, his throat tightening. The horse that had led him here tonight was the same animal his uncle had trusted decades ago. The weight of it pressed down on him. This wasn't inheritance by accident. Rusty was a living thread between past and present, carrying secrets across years. John slipped the photograph into his pocket, needing proof that he wasn't imagining the connection. When he climbed back to the surface, Ethan's anxious eyes met his. "What's down there?" the boy asked, voice taut. "Books," John said slowly, dust still clinging to his palms. "Bottles. Your great-uncle was working on something. More than peaches." He didn't show Ethan the photograph yet. Some truths needed time. Rusty stepped closer, breath fogging in the cool air, and nudged John's shoulder with his muzzle. The gesture was firm, insistent, as though the horse demanded recognition. John reached up, running a hand over the rough star on Rusty's brow. "You knew," he whispered, more to himself than to the horse. Ethan crouched by the hatch, peering down into the dark. "Do you think it could help us?" His words were small, fragile, carrying more weight than a child should bear. John's chest ached. He thought of hospital bills, of sleepless nights, of his son's narrow shoulders shaking with each cough. He wanted to say yes, wanted to believe that golden liquid could hold an answer. But truth was a careful thing, and promises could break a boy's spirit faster than illness. "I don't know," John admitted, his voice low. "But we're going to find out." The orchard around them groaned with the weight of wind through brittle branches. Dust swirled in small spirals at their feet. And yet, standing there with Rusty at his side, John felt something shift inside him. Not hope, not yet, but the possibility of it. That night he laid the notebooks on the kitchen table, lantern light flickering across the pages. Words swam before him. Resilient strains, enhanced nectar, sustainable yields. There were diagrams of roots and soil, equations in margins, and pages marked with dates that stretched back longer than John had expected. His uncle hadn't just farmed. He had been chasing discovery, one that others had likely never known about. He reached into his pocket and unfolded the photograph again. Rusty's younger self stood so solid in the frame, the uncle's hand resting on his neck. The horse was more than livestock. He had been partner, guardian, perhaps even witness. John stared across the room where Rusty shifted in his stall just outside, the faint shuffle of hooves against hay audible through the thin walls. "Whatever this is," John murmured, more prayer than statement, "we're in it together." And in the hush that followed, Ethan stirred in his room. Rusty exhaled softly through the barn slats, and the orchard, dead as it looked, seemed to listen. The rain came sudden that evening, sharp against the valley floor, a break in weeks of dry heat. It rattled across the orchard roof, pinged against rusted gutters, and drummed on the tin sheets of the old barn. John leaned against the stall post inside, lantern set low at his feet. The barn smelled of wet hay and iron, damp earth drifting in through the cracks. Rusty shifted in his stall, his chestnut coat slick where the leaks dripped through. John had meant only to check the roof and feed the horse, but the storm pressed him into stillness. His boots sank into the straw as he stood there, shoulders hunched. Words began to press up inside him, words he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. The rain masked his voice, gave him cover. "You want to know the truth?" he said, his voice hoarse, pitched low as though someone might overhear. "I'm done. I've tried, year after year, to keep this life alive. I lost the farm, lost my wife, and now all I've got left is Ethan, too young to carry the weight I've laid on his shoulders." Rusty's ears twitched, his head turning toward John. His breath fogged in the lantern. "Light." John pressed his fists against the wood. "I can't pay the bills. Can't cover his treatments. I can't even give him more than a roof that leaks and food that barely stretches week to week. And you—" he let out a bitter laugh. "You're supposed to be part of the inheritance that saves me? An old chestnut horse no one else wanted?" The horse stepped closer, the boards creaking under his weight. John rubbed at his face with calloused hands, tiredness cutting deep. "I thought I could take the orchard and flip it, sell it off, put the money toward Ethan's care. But this place—" He gestured toward the rafters, the orchard beyond, the trunk of notebooks waiting on the kitchen table. "It's a graveyard. Just like me." The rain beat harder, drowning the confession in its rhythm. Rusty moved again, closing the space between them. His muzzle pressed into John's shoulder, firm and insistent. The warmth of that touch broke something loose inside the man. He didn't push it away. His body sagged against the stall, a single tear slipping down his cheek. He hated crying. It made him feel weak, stripped bare. But the horse didn't judge, didn't turn away. Rusty simply stood, solid and unmoving, a presence that seemed to anchor John against the storm. Through the crack of thunder, another sound emerged, a knock against the barn door. John startled, pulling back as the lantern flame wavered. The door creaked open, and Sarah Lopez stepped inside, rain dripping from her shawl. She carried a covered tin dish in her arms, steam rising from beneath the cloth. You looked like you could use something warm, she said, her voice steady despite the storm. She set the dish on a barrel, pulling back the cloth to reveal peach cobbler, golden crust still bubbling at the edges. I baked too much. Figured you and Ethan might need it more than I do. John cleared his throat, embarrassed by the tears he hadn't fully hidden. You shouldn't have come out in this weather. Sarah shrugged, shaking water from her hair. It's only rain. The valley's been waiting for it. Her eyes flicked toward Rusty, who still stood close, ears relaxed now, his breath calm. He's a good one, she said softly, almost to herself. John didn't answer. He didn't know how. Instead, he lifted the dish, inhaling the warmth of cinnamon and sugar, the scent almost foreign in the barn's musk. For a moment, the cobbler felt like more than food. It was an offering, a small reminder that kindness still lived somewhere in the valley. They stood in silence for a while, the storm hammering outside, the lantern glow painting soft halos against the wood. Sarah wrapped her shawl tighter and finally said, Don't give up on this place too soon, John. Sometimes things bloom where you least expect them. When she left, the barn door creaked shut behind her, and John was alone again with Rusty. The horse nudged him once more, as if sealing the words Sarah had left behind. John laid a hand on the star marking on Rusty's forehead and whispered, I don't know if I can, old boy. But maybe you do. The rain softened through the night, leaving the orchard washed clean. Inside the barn, under the tin roof that had carried his confession, John felt the faintest shift inside himself. Not a resolution, not yet, but the smallest crack where light might one day enter. The rain had left behind a thin sheen of mud across the orchard floor, softening the cracks in the earth, but not reviving the trees. Still, for the first time in months, John felt a trace of energy stirring in him. Maybe it was Sarah's cobbler, maybe the storm, or maybe the way Rusty had stood by him in silence as he bared his failures. Whatever the cause, he woke early and decided it was time to do something more than just watch the orchard decay. By mid-morning, John had dragged out a bundle of irrigation pipes from the shed, steel lengths covered in dust and cobwebs. He wiped them down with his sleeve and began laying them along the rows. His plan was simple. Patch the old lines, get water flowing again, and see if any part of the orchard might still breathe. Ethan sat nearby on an overturned crate, sketching a rough map of the rows on a piece of cardboard with a pencil stub. The boy looked fragile in the pale light, but his eyes glinted with focus as he drew arrows, marking where the lines could run. Rusty stood in the shade of the barn, ears flicking with each clang of pipe against pipe. He shifted uneasily every time metal rang out, his hooves pawing at the dirt. At first John thought nothing of it, horses startled at all sorts of noises, but the tension in Rusty's muscles never eased. When a wrench slipped from John's hand and hit the ground with a sharp crack, Rusty snorted loudly, jerking his head high, eyes wide. "Easy, boy," John called, setting the wrench down carefully. He approached slowly, palm open, until Rusty's breathing settled again. The horse leaned his forehead gently against John's chest, trembling faintly. It was then John noticed the scar, thin but long, running down the inside of Rusty's rear leg. Old, but deep enough to tell a story. Someone, some time, had left their mark on this horse with steel. John stroked the horse's mane, the chestnut strands tangled and coarse under his hand. "You've seen worse than this, haven't you?" he whispered. Rusty's eye blinked slow, steady, as though confirming it. The clang of pipes carried through the valley, joined by Sarah's voice when she came walking up the lane with a basket hooked on her arm. She wore her hair tied back, her dress plain, her boots caked with mud. "Thought you could use a break," she said, setting down bread wrapped in paper and a jar of jam. Her eyes flicked to the pipes stretching across the orchard. "Looks like you're finally putting muscle to this land again." "Trying to," John admitted, wiping sweat from his brow. "Not sure it'll matter." Sarah glanced at Ethan, who held up his penciled map with quiet pride. "It matters," she said firmly. "Even if nothing grows, he'll see his dad still fighting." They ate bread and jam under the shade of the barn, while Rusty stood close, his head low near Ethan's shoulder. The boy whispered to him, pointing at the drawing, and the horse's ear swiveled as though listening. John watched, struck again by the ease between them. Rusty wasn't just a horse left behind. He was becoming part of their circle, silent but present in every moment. That afternoon, as John hammered clamps into place, the pipes rattled with a loud metallic clang. Rusty bolted a few steps, nostrils flared, then froze, looking back at John with an expression so raw it pulled at him. The scar on the horse's leg caught the light, stark and unhidden. John dropped the hammer, walked over, and placed both hands against Rusty's neck. "I know," he murmured. "It's just us here now. No more steel, no more hurt." The horse blew out a breath, warm against John's cheek, and lowered his head until it nearly touched the dirt. It was a gesture not of fear, but of surrender, a kind of trust too fragile to mistake. John stood with him until the tremor in the animal's shoulders passed, the clang of metal fading into the background of cicadas and the distant hum of a highway. By sundown, the pipes lay across the orchard like silver veins waiting for blood. John hadn't yet fixed the pump, hadn't tested the flow, but something about the lines running straight and true across the soil made the land feel less abandoned. Ethan clapped his hands softly, pleased with the sight, while Sarah nodded in approval before heading back down the lane. Alone again, John leaned against the barn door, looking at the chestnut horse standing in the fading light. Rusty turned his head, his eyes reflecting the sunset's last fire. The orchard was still broken, the trees still brittle, the debts still circling. But in that moment, with steel laid and silence holding steady, John felt that maybe the ground was shifting under his feet. He whispered into the twilight, not sure if it was for himself, his son, or the horse. "We'll get through this." One way or another, Rusty flicked his tail, stamped once against the softened earth, and for the first time since John had inherited the ruin, the orchard didn't feel quite so hopeless. The orchard had begun to look less like a graveyard, and more like a place caught between ruin and possibility. Pipes lay neat along the rows, clamps tightened, and even though water had not yet flowed, the lines themselves whispered of purpose. Ethan had hung his penciled map on the refrigerator door, like a blueprint for the future. Rusty lingered close whenever John walked the land, his chestnut coat glowing beneath the sun, his steady presence like a shadow that had chosen to follow when late born. Afternoon, as the cicadas droned and the light turned amber across the fields, a dark sedan rolled slowly down the dirt lane. Its tires kicked up dust in perfect spirals until it stopped near the house. From it stepped Richard Hale, tall and broad in a pale suit that looked out of place against the weather-beaten porch. His shoes, polished to a shine, sank into the soft earth with disdain. John wiped his hands on his jeans, suspicion hardening his jaw. He knew Hale by reputation, the man who held water rights like reins in this valley, who had bought and sold land until entire families were forced to leave. Hale removed his hat with practiced politeness, though his eyes were sharp as glass. "John Miller," he said warmly, though the words felt rehearsed. "I heard you came into an inheritance." Thought I'd pay a neighborly visit. Neighbors didn't arrive in polished sedans, John thought. But he only nodded and motioned toward the porch. Ethan appeared at the screen door, curious, cap tilted back, and Hale offered him a smile too smooth to be sincere. "Fine boy you've got there," he said, before turning back to John. Inside the kitchen, Hale pulled a folded check from his jacket and laid it neatly on the scarred table. The paper gleamed under the afternoon light, the ink fresh, the numbers large enough to make John's chest tighten. It was more than he'd seen in years, more than enough to cover Ethan's medical bills, to pay down debts, to start over somewhere else. "I'll take the orchard off your hands," Hale said, sliding the check forward with 2 fingers. "You don't need the burden. This land's dried up. Let me deal with it. You can put your boy where he belongs, in a place with hospitals and air conditioning instead of dust." The words struck sharp. For a moment, John's hand hovered near the check, as if pulled by gravity. The zeros swam in his vision, promising relief. He imagined Ethan in a clean hospital bed, machines humming, doctors not asking about payment first. He imagined escape. But beyond the window, Rusty stood at the fence line, ears flicked forward, gaze steady. His chestnut coat caught the low sun, and he shifted once, stamping a hoof into the dirt as though reminding John of something buried deeper than numbers on a page. John swallowed hard and looked away from the check. "This place isn't for sale," he said, voice firm but quiet. Hale's smile didn't falter, but the edge in his eyes sharpened. "Don't be foolish. That orchard's dead, and you know it. I'm offering you freedom. Take it." "I said no," John repeated, pushing the check back across the table. His fingers left faint smudges of dirt on the polished surface. Silence hung for a long moment, broken only by the ticking of the kitchen clock. Finally, Hale tucked the check back into his jacket, smoothing the fabric as though nothing had happened. "Think it over," he said softly. "The valley doesn't. Forgive pride, John, and neither do banks." He rose, touched the brim of his hat, and left with the same careful grace he'd arrived. The sedan's engine hummed low as it rolled back down the lane, leaving only dust hanging in the air. Ethan stepped into the kitchen, his eyes wide. "Dad, that money could have fixed everything." John crouched, resting a hand on his son's shoulder. "Money doesn't fix everything, and not all offers are what they seem." He didn't explain further, didn't mention the weight in Hale's gaze, or the stories whispered about land deals gone wrong. Instead, he glanced out the window, where Rusty still waited, calm and immovable. That night, John sat on the porch with Ethan dozing beside him and the lantern flickering at their feet. Rusty grazed nearby, the faint sound of his chewing steady as a metronome. John thought of the cellar, of the golden bottles sealed by his uncle's hand, of the photograph that proved Rusty had been part of this place for decades. He thought of Hale's check, how easy it would have been to take it. But the orchard was more than dirt. It held a history, a secret, and a horse that had led him to both. Selling it would mean silencing something that had survived too long to be betrayed now. John leaned back, his eyes closing against the hum of summer night. "We'll find another way," he whispered into the dark. Rusty lifted his head, ears pricked as though hearing the vow, and for the first time in years, John felt the strange weight of resolve settle heavier than despair. The days after Hale's visit hung heavy with unease. John worked the orchard in silence, patching pipes and oiling the old pump, while Ethan traced lines on his cardboard map, pretending it was enough to call the trees alive. But the land still looked weary, and the air carried a weight that pressed down on everything. Even the birds seemed to avoid the rows, leaving the orchard to cicadas and the occasional sigh of wind. It was Rusty who broke the stillness. One afternoon, as John checked the pump near the barn, the chestnut horse raised his head sharply and walked with purpose toward the far end of the orchard. His hooves thudded against dry earth, steady and sure, ears flicking as though following an old signal. John frowned, wiping grease from his hands, then followed with Ethan close behind. They reached the edge of the property where weeds grew tall and thorny. In their midst stood a stone circle, half collapsed. An old well, long forgotten. Its rim was cracked, vines curling through the stones, and the wooden cover sagged under years of neglect. Rusty stopped there, stamping once, and then lowered his head to sniff at the broken boards. John crouched, prying at the warped cover. The wood groaned, giving way with a splintering snap. A rush of air escaped, stale and cool, carrying the smell of damp earth and rust. He held the lantern over the opening, its glow revealing the dark shaft. Instead of water, only shadows stared back. But near the surface, wedged between stones, something glinted. With Ethan's small flashlight steadying the beam, John reached down, fingers brushing against cold metal. He pulled free a tin box, dented and spotted with rust. Its weight surprised him. He set it on the grass, pried at the lid, and after a stubborn groan, it yielded. Inside lay packets of seeds, carefully wrapped in wax paper, each labeled in his uncle's cramped handwriting. Hybrid 12A, Nectar Strain, Resilient Root. Alongside them were rolled notes, diagrams of grafting patterns, and at the very bottom, a sealed envelope. John opened it carefully, revealing a letter written in faded ink. The words were simple but deliberate. If you find this, it means you've inherited not just land, but duty. These seeds carry resilience the world may try to bury. Protect them, and they will protect those who come after you. Trust the horse. He knows what I could not say aloud. John stared at the page, his hands trembling. The letter didn't explain everything, but it carried a weight heavier than gold. His uncle hadn't been experimenting for profit. He had been fighting for survival, for the valley, maybe even for families like theirs. Ethan touched the packets of seeds with reverence. Dad, these could grow again, couldn't they? Even if the trees are dying? His voice carried fragile hope, too fragile to crush. Maybe, John said quietly. He tucked the packets back into the tin, closing it gently. But we'll need to be careful. If Hale finds out... His voice trailed off. He didn't need to finish. They both knew the man's reach stretched farther than fences. Rusty snorted, shaking his mane as though dismissing the fear. He stood tall beside them, his coat burning copper in the fading light. John slid the tin box under his arm and rested his other hand on the horse's neck. Seems like you knew where this was all along, he murmured. Rusty pressed forward, the star on his brow brushing against John's sleeve, sealing a silent pact. That night, back at the house, John set the tin box on the table beside the notebooks and bottles. The lantern threw a golden circle across them all, the past crowding the present. Outside, Rusty's silhouette moved slowly along the fence line, patient as always. John leaned back in his chair, the letter spread before him. His uncle's words echoed in his head. Trust the horse. He had doubted almost everything in his life these past years, his choices, his strength, his future, but not Rusty. Somehow, without a word, the horse had led him from despair to discovery. He looked at Ethan, who had fallen asleep with his head on the table, one hand resting near the box of seeds. The boy's breathing was shallow but even, and his cap had slipped to the floor. John reached out, covering Ethan's hand with his own. Outside, the night deepened, cool and quiet. The orchard stood, still, but for the first time, John felt it wasn't lifeless. It was waiting, like the seeds, like the horse, like himself, for something to begin again. He whispered into the silence, "We'll keep it safe." I promise. Rusty's answering snort carried softly through the open window, and the orchard seemed to breathe with them. The barn had always been a place of shadows, its rafters high and blackened with years of dust, the boards split by time. But on that evening, lanterns glowed along the beams, their soft yellow light catching dust motes that drifted like slow fireflies. The orchard outside lay quiet in the twilight, rows of weary trees watching over the gathering within. For the first time since inheriting the land, John heard voices filling the barn instead of silence. Sarah had come early with a basket of fresh bread, her hands firm but her smile gentle. She moved through the barn as if she had always belonged there, laying cloth across an old work table, spreading plates and jars as if setting a Sunday table. Soon after, 2 neighboring farmers arrived, one carrying a pot of beans, the other a pan of cornbread that smelled of butter and salt. Even Naomi Park, the freelance journalist who had been passing through town, showed up with a notebook tucked into her jacket pocket. She had heard whispers of the orchard and wanted to see for herself what was rising here. Ethan sat near Rusty's stall, his small shoulders relaxed for once, sketching shapes in his notebook with a pencil Sarah had given him. The horse leaned close, warm breath stirring the boy's cap as if reading over his shoulder. Occasionally Ethan spoke softly to him, pointing out lines and arrows on the page, and Rusty's ear would flick toward him as though listening with intent. The sight drew quiet smiles from the adults, a simple grace no words could match. The meal itself was plain. Bread, beans, jam from Sarah's cupboard, cornbread still steaming from the oven. Yet in the barn, with lanterns swinging and conversation flowing, it felt rich. They spoke of weather, of old harvests, of debts and dry years, and though their voices carried the weight of struggle, there was laughter too. John sat among them, awkward at first, then slowly allowing himself to breathe in the warmth. For years he had kept to himself, shoulders hunched under failure. But here, sharing food on rough boards, he felt something stir that he thought he had lost. Belonging. Naomi asked careful questions, her pencil scratching across the page, but she didn't press too hard. She looked around the barn, at Rusty's chestnut coat glowing in the lantern light, at the tin box and notebooks stacked on a shelf nearby. And she said simply, "There's a story here." One worth telling right, John tensed, unsure if he wanted that story out in the open. But Sarah's hand on his arm calmed him, her eyes steady. Sometimes the truth needs air, John. Even seeds stay buried too long before they grow. Rusty stamped once in his stall, a hollow thud against the floor, as if echoing her point. The horse's presence was constant, a kind of guardian to the words unspoken around the table. John looked at him and thought again of the photograph of his uncle with that same horse, decades younger, but already carrying secrets. As the evening waned, Ethan nodded off against Rusty's side, the horse standing perfectly still, as though he understood the boy's fragility. Conversation softened into murmurs, dishes clinked in quiet rhythm, and lanterns dimmed. One by one the neighbors left, offering firm handshakes and quiet encouragement. Naomi tucked her notebook away, promising not to print a word without John's say. Sarah lingered, gathering dishes, her presence unhurried, her glance at John unspoken but steady. When the barn was nearly empty, John stood alone with Rusty and the sleeping boy. The lantern light flickered low, shadows swaying across the horse's flanks. John reached out, running his hand along the coarse mane, and whispered, "For the first time in a long while, this place feels alive." Rusty exhaled, the warm breath rolling across John's arm, and lowered his head to nuzzle gently at Ethan's cap. The orchard outside was still the same, trees brittle, debts unpaid, future uncertain. But inside the barn that night, with the scent of bread and beans still hanging in the air, something had changed. It was not salvation. Not yet. But it was a step, like water running through pipes not yet tested, like seeds waiting beneath soil for the right season. A beginning. The morning broke with a thin veil of fog over the orchard, pale and cool, softening the cracked silhouettes of the peach trees. For a moment, the land looked almost forgiving, the haze disguising the brittle branches and lifeless soil. John stepped out of the house with a mug of coffee, boots sinking lightly into damp earth, and let himself breathe the rare quiet. Ethan still slept, his cap on the nightstand, his breathing steady. Rusty grazed lazily near the barn, the chestnut of his coat glowing against the silver mist. It might have been a good day, John thought, until he walked toward the orchard rows and saw the ground glisten with water. At first he thought it was dew. Then his stomach dropped. The new irrigation lines, the ones he and Ethan had worked to lay, were split open. Water pooled in the dirt, spilling uselessly into gullies, carrying mud instead of promise. The pipes had been slashed clean, not broken by age or accident, but cut with a sharp blade. His coffee slipped from his hand, dark liquid soaking into the soil as he crouched to inspect the damage. Every few yards another pipe lay split, clamps twisted free, rubber gaskets scattered. Someone had walked the rows with deliberate malice, undoing days of work in a single night. The fog muffled sound, but John thought he could almost hear laughter in the silence. Rusty raised his head from grazing. Ears flicked forward, body taut. He stamped once, then twice, his gaze fixed down the lane as though he still sensed the intruder's presence. The horse's breath came quick, his muscles tight beneath his chestnut hide. John walked to him, laid a steadying hand on his neck, but his own heart hammered with the same unease. Back at the house, Ethan was already awake, sitting at the table with the tin box of seeds beside him as if he had guarded it through the night. When John told him what had happened, the boy's face fell. "Dad, they don't want us here." John clenched his fists, then opened them again, palms raw with helplessness. He thought of Hale's smooth voice, of the check laid across the kitchen table, of the way he had warned that pride could ruin a man. Pride wasn't what had split those pipes. It was power. Someone wanted the orchard to stay dead, to make him desperate enough to sell. But John wasn't ready to surrender. He gathered tools, patches, and clamps, and he and Ethan went back into the fog to kneel in the mud. Together they pressed rubber against steel, tightened screws with chilled fingers, and set each line back into place. Rusty stood guard a few steps away, ears swiveling, body poised like a sentinel. Every clang of the wrench echoed through the orchard, every metallic click a quiet declaration that they would not quit. As the sun rose higher, Sarah appeared at the fence, shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She didn't ask what had happened. The sight of muddy boots and broken clamps told her enough. Instead, she stepped quietly into the row, knelt beside Ethan, and helped hold the pipe steady while John worked the bolts. Her presence was wordless solidarity, and when the final line was patched, she handed Ethan a piece of cloth to wipe his hands. "It's not over," she said softly, looking at John. "But you're not fighting alone." The fog burned off slowly, revealing the orchard once more in its stark truth. Rows of tired trees, patched pipes glinting like scars in the light. John stood with mud on his jeans, grease on his hands, and his son at his side. Rusty walked forward then, lowering his head until his muzzle brushed John's shoulder, warm breath soaking through the fabric. It was a gesture not of fear this time, but of steady defiance, as if the horse himself vowed to stand against whatever hands had tried to erase them in the night. That evening, when the pump was tested, water trickled at first, then hissed through the patched lines. Drops clung to the brittle leaves, sparkling in the low sun. It wasn't enough to bring the orchard back to life, not yet, but it was proof that resilience was possible. Ethan laughed softly at the sight, the sound fragile but true, and Sarah smiled faintly, her arms folded across her chest as though holding in her own relief. John sat on the porch long after the others had gone inside, the tin box of seeds resting on his lap. The night air was cool, the stars sharp. He thought again of his uncle's letter, of the words scratched in fading ink. Trust the horse. Rusty stood just beyond the porch light, his silhouette steady against the dark. The horse lifted his head, catching John's eye, and in that gaze John felt something he hadn't in years, the certainty that even in the face of sabotage, they were not beaten. The orchard lay quiet, scarred, but not broken. Neither was he. The morning after the sabotage felt different. The orchard carried the marks of what had been done. Mud still clung to boots left by unknown hands, clamps bore fresh scratches, and the patched pipes gleamed like stitched wounds under the sun. Yet John did not feel broken. Instead, a quiet determination settled in his chest, a kind of weight that pressed, but did not crush. Rusty walked beside him along the rows, ears forward, as though sharing the watch. By mid-morning, John drove into town. The courthouse sat in the center, a square brick building with tall white columns, its flag limp in the still air. Inside, the hall smelled of old wood polish and paper. Years of filings, deeds, and forgotten promises stacked into silence. Ethan came along, moving slowly, his cap pulled low, his map tucked under his arm like a talisman. Sarah had urged John to check the county records, to see if his uncle had left more than just scattered notes. The clerk at the land office was a woman with gray hair pinned tight, glasses sliding down her nose. She shuffled through drawers when John gave his uncle's name. After a pause, She returned with a rolled sheet bound in oilskin, the surface stained with time. "Been sitting here for decades," she said, handing it across. "Strange thing. Most men don't file maps like this unless they're hiding something." John unrolled it on a table by the window. The parchment crackled, the ink faded but legible. It wasn't just a survey of orchard rows. It showed underground channels, shaded areas marked with symbols, and notes scrawled along the edges in his uncle's neat hand. There were references to water rights, easements, and one particular mark near the edge of the orchard. Reserve trench, not disclosed. John traced it with his finger, his breath caught. This was no ordinary farm map. It was evidence of something deliberately withheld, protected. Ethan leaned closer, his eyes wide. "Dad, it looks like there's another place. Something buried." His voice quivered, not with fear, but with excitement. The clerk frowned as she adjusted her glasses. "Your uncle fought hard over water allocations. Everyone knew he wouldn't sell out to Hale's company. If this map is right, he had rights grandfathered in. Rights Hale probably doesn't want anyone remembering." She glanced at John, then at Ethan. "You be careful. Paper like this has gotten men in trouble." John rolled the map carefully and slid it back into its oilskin case. He thanked the clerk, but his thoughts raced. The sabotage in the orchard suddenly made sharper sense. Hale hadn't just wanted the land, he wanted everything buried beneath it. And Rusty, leading him to the cellar. The seeds, the dry well, had been pointing him in the same direction all along. On the drive home, Ethan held the map in his lap, tracing the faded ink as though it were treasure. Rusty was waiting when they pulled up, head raised, nostrils flaring as if he knew something new had entered their lives. John carried the map inside, spreading it on the table beside the notebooks and tin box. The lantern light revealed the marks clearer, each line a thread connecting past to present. That night, as the wind swept softly through the orchard, John sat with the oilskin map before him. Rusty stood outside the open window, his silhouette solid against the moonlit rows. The horse stamped once, his steady rhythm answering the pulse inside John's chest. "Your master left this for us," John whispered. "And somehow you've been guarding it all along." The orchard creaked in the night air, leaves whispering like voices too faint to catch. John closed his eyes, the weight of the map heavy under his hands, the knowledge that what he carried was more than inheritance. It was leverage, it was truth, it was danger. When he rose from the table, he folded the map back into its oilskin and placed it with the other relics of his uncle's work. He stood at the doorway, watching Rusty graze, the horse lifting his head to meet his gaze. In those dark eyes, John saw what his uncle must have seen decades ago. A silent witness, a guardian not of fences and barns, but of secrets and legacies buried deep in the land. The night pressed close, quiet, but not empty. And for the first time, John felt the orchard breathe with hidden life, waiting for its story to be told. The days following the discovery of the oilskin map weighed on John like a stone in his pocket. He carried it everywhere, unrolling it late at night under the lantern light, tracing the faded marks with his rough fingers. Ethan hovered over his shoulder, memorizing the sketches as if they were a code to a hidden future. Rusty often stood outside the open window, his steady presence anchoring John to the soil even as his mind spun with possibilities. The map had revealed something deeper than just boundaries. It showed water rights, easements, and a mysterious trench his uncle had never declared. John knew he needed someone who understood the system better than he did. someone who had worked the valves and channels when the orchard was still alive. His search led him to the small trailer park on the outskirts of town, where retired field hands lived quietly among rows of faded aluminum siding. There, he found Ben Ortega. The old man was bent from years of labor, his skin leathered by sun, his hands still stained with oil, though he hadn't worked a pump in decades. He greeted John cautiously, squinting against the late afternoon. "Son, Miller, right? You look like your uncle around the eyes." He was stubborn as stone. John unrolled the map on Ben's kitchen table, the surface scarred with burn marks from old cigarettes. The old man stared at it for a long moment, his jaw tightening. So, he left it after all. Damn fool never could leave a fight unfinished. His finger tapped the mark labeled Reserve Trench. "You know what this is?" John asked. Ben nodded slowly. "Your uncle fought Hale's people over that very channel. The trench runs under half this valley, but he kept his section hidden. Said he wouldn't let corporate hands dry out the small farms. I was the valve keeper back then. His voice faltered. "I looked the other way when they siphoned water. I let them steal what was yours." Silence pressed into the small trailer. Outside, a dog barked, and the hum of distant traffic filled the pause. Ben's shoulders sagged under a weight heavier than his age. "They paid me to stay quiet. Not much, but enough to feed my kids. I told myself it was survival. But your uncle, he never forgave me. He told me one day someone would come asking, and I'd have to answer." John sat back, the confession burning in his chest. He thought of the broken pipes, the slashed lines, the check on his table, and realized the fight had started long before him. Ben's silence had been another link in the chain that bound the orchard to Hale's power. "I can't undo it," Ben said, voice rough. "But I kept records, copies of valve logs, water allocations, signatures. Thought maybe one day it'd matter. They're in a box under the bed." He rose slowly, joints creaking, and dragged out a battered cardboard box. Inside were folders thick with papers, ink faded but legible. Schedules, diagrams, names of company men who had signed off on diversions. John leafed through them, his heart pounding. These weren't just scraps. They were proof. Proof his uncle's orchard had been robbed. Proof Hale's empire was built on theft. Rusty stamped outside, tethered near the trailer, his chestnut coat gleaming in the lowering sun. His ears flicked back and forth as though sensing the shift inside. John folded the papers back into the box and looked at Ben. "Why are you giving me this now?" The old man's eyes were wet, though his voice stayed steady. "Because I don't want to die carrying the weight of silence. Your uncle fought with honor. I betrayed that. Maybe you can finish what he started when John left the trailer, box in hand." Rusty whickered softly, brushing his muzzle against John's arm. The horse's breath was warm, steady, grounding. John tightened his grip on the box, feeling the weight of both paper and history. "We've got allies now," he murmured, meeting the horse's dark eyes. That night, back in the barn, John spread the documents beside the oilskin map and the tin box of seeds. The lantern's glow lit them like relics laid. On an altar, Ethan leaned against Rusty's flank, the boy's thin frame steady in the horse's shadow. Sarah arrived later, carrying soup in a jar, and sat quietly as John explained what he had learned. She listened, her face pale but resolute. "This isn't just about saving the orchard anymore," she said at last. "It's about truth. And truth has enemies." Rusty shifted, stamping once on the barn floor, his breath a low huff in the quiet. John reached to rest his hand on the horse's brow, the star-shaped marking warm beneath his palm. "Then we'll guard it together," he whispered. The orchard outside groaned under the night wind, the trees creaking like old bones. But inside the barn, with documents spread wide and the horse standing sentinel, John felt the first stirrings of strength greater than fear. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. The days lengthened into a brittle summer stretch, the orchard caught between exhaustion and endurance. The patched irrigation lines hissed with the faint trickle of water, enough to dampen the soil, but not enough to restore the trees. Yet every evening, John walked the rows with Ethan and Rusty at his side, tracing the outlines of survival. The tin box of seeds sat on the kitchen shelf like a quiet promise. The oilskin map and Ben Ortega's papers stacked neatly beside it. They were fragments of truth, but truth by itself didn't pay bills or ward off powerful men. Richard Hale returned when the heat hung low over the valley. This time he came on foot, his sedan parked at the end of the lane, dust still swirling behind it. He walked the cracked path like he owned it, the brim of his hat casting a sharp line across his eyes. John was mending a fence post when he saw him, Ethan drawing nearby in the dirt with a stick, Rusty grazing just beyond. "John," Hale called smoothly, voice carrying the ease of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I trust you've had time to think." John straightened slowly, leaning against the post. "I thought." "My answer hasn't changed." Hale stepped closer, pulling a folded sheet from his jacket. It was another check, this one fatter than before, the numbers almost dizzying. He laid it across the fence rail between them, paper bright against splintered wood. "This will cover your boy's medical care, and then some. You can walk away from this dried-up orchard with your head high. Or," his tone hardened, "you can stay and drown under debts that won't forgive you." The temptation hit like a blow. John's eyes flicked to Ethan, still crouched in the dust, lips pursed in concentration as he sketched Rusty's outline. His son's chest rose and fell with effort, each breath harder than it should be for a boy his age. That check could buy him a better chance, better doctors, maybe even time. John's throat tightened. Rusty lifted his head suddenly, ears pricked. The horse stepped forward and pressed his muzzle against John's shoulder, a steady, "Wait." The memory of nights in the barn returned, his confession under the tin roof, the silent understanding in the horse's eyes. It was as if Rusty was reminding him that what they carried wasn't just hardship. It was a legacy, one his uncle had guarded at great cost. John pushed the check back across the rail. His voice was quiet, but steady. "We're staying." Hale's jaw tightened, his polished mask slipping for a flicker. "You're making a mistake, Miller." "No," John said, lifting his chin. "The mistake would be selling what isn't mine alone. This orchard doesn't just belong to me. It belonged to my uncle, and now to my son. And this horse," he glanced at Rusty, who stood unwavering at his side. "He's been carrying secrets longer than you've been writing checks." "We'll see this through," Ethan looked up then, sensing the weight in his father's voice. He rose and came to stand beside John, his small frame thin but determined. "We're not leaving," the boy said simply. For the first time, Hale looked unsettled. He folded the check, tucked it away, and stepped back. His voice dropped, colder now. "Then be ready. The valley doesn't forgive defiance. Neither do I." With that, he turned and walked back down the lane, dust rising in small storms around his shoes. The silence that followed was heavy. John felt Ethan's hand slip into his, small and warm, and he looked down to see the boy watching him with something close to pride. Rusty exhaled, stamping once against the hard ground, as though sealing the vow that had just been made. That night, John sat with Sarah on the porch, the papers and map spread between them. She listened without interruption as he explained what Hale had offered and what he had refused. Her expression was not surprise, but quiet affirmation, as if she had known all along which way his heart would lean. "You did right," she said softly. "This land may not forgive weakness, but it honors those who stand." Rusty moved in the shadows of the orchard, his chestnut coat a dark flame under the moonlight. John watched him and felt the choice settle deeper than his bones. It was no longer about selling or staying. It was about belonging, about refusing to let go of what had been entrusted to him, no matter the cost. As the night deepened, he whispered into the quiet, "We stay." No matter what comes, Rusty lifted his head at the words, ears forward, as though he understood. The morning of the hearing dawned clear, the valley washed in a pale gold light that made the orchard look softer than it was. John stood on the porch with his shirt freshly laundered, collar stiff against his neck. He had borrowed a jacket from Sarah's late husband, too broad at the shoulders, but respectable enough for what lay ahead. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, sketching Rusty with careful strokes, the boy's lips pressed tight in concentration. When John kissed the top of his son's head, he caught the faint tremor in Ethan's breathing and whispered, "We'll make it right, son. For you, for him, for this land." The county building stood tall in the center of town, its facade clean, but its halls worn by years of disputes. Farmers in work boots, clerks in gray suits, and lawyers carrying leather briefcases crowded the steps. Sarah walked beside John, her shawl wrapped firmly around her shoulders. Behind them came Ben Ortega, carrying a box of his old records with a determination that seemed to straighten his bent frame. Naomi trailed with her notebook, her eyes sharp, ready to witness. Inside the hearing room, wood-paneled walls held the weight of generations. A long table faced the county board, 3 officials seated behind microphones, their expressions weary but attentive. On one side sat John, Sarah, Ben, and Naomi. On the other, Richard Hale, with his lawyers in pressed suits, their briefcases clicking open like weapons. Rusty wasn't allowed inside, but John could feel his presence just beyond the window, tethered under an oak tree, his chestnut coat flashing through the glass. The hearing began with formalities, then shifted to evidence. John laid the oilskin map across the table, its edges curled, ink faded, but still defiant. The board members leaned forward, frowning at the markings, whispering to one another. Sarah read aloud from his uncle's notes, her voice steady as she described the sustainable methods and the hidden water channels. Ben followed, his voice gravelly with age, admitting his role in past diversions. "I stayed silent," he said plainly. "But silence steals more than words. It steals truth. This orchard was robbed. I won't stand quiet any longer." Across the room, Hale's lawyer rose, his words smooth, dismissing the map as outdated, the notes as unverified, and Ben as unreliable. He painted John as a desperate farmer clinging to myths, a man too poor to see reason. Hale himself never raised his voice. He simply sat with arms folded, eyes cold, as if the outcome was already written. But then Naomi spoke. She didn't read from notes, didn't cite figures. Instead, she described what she had seen in the barn. Neighbors sharing food, a boy leaning against a horse's chestnut flank, a father working broken pipes with his bare hands. Sometimes truth isn't just numbers, she told the board. It's what you see when people fight for something larger than themselves. The room fell into a hush. John looked down at his hands, calloused and scarred, resting on the table. For the first time in years, he wasn't ashamed of them. He raised his head and spoke simply. I'm not asking for handouts. I'm asking for recognition that this orchard was built on resilience and stolen from. Give it a chance to live again, for my son, for this valley, for everyone who was told their fight didn't matter. Through the window, Rusty stamped once, the sound carrying faintly into the room, as if punctuating the plea. Heads turned toward the noise, and for a moment even the board members seemed to sense the weight of something beyond paper. The deliberation took an hour. Hale's lawyers whispered, shuffled papers, tried to keep their composure. John sat with Sarah's hand steady on his arm, Ethan's drawing folded in his pocket, and the faint sound of Rusty breathing outside the glass. When the board returned, their decision was brief. The orchard would be recognized under heritage protection, and the documents would trigger a review of water allocations, stretching back decades. Hale's jaw tightened, his lips curling into a smile that held no warmth. He leaned close as he passed John on his way out. You think this is victory? You've only woken the storm. His polished shoes clicked against the tile until the sound faded down the corridor. John remained seated for a moment longer, his hands gripping the map. Relief flooded him, but it was not triumph. It was the feeling of a man who had chosen to stay and now realized what staying would cost. Outside, Rusty lifted his head toward the sun, ears pricked forward, waiting. When John stepped into the daylight, Ethan rushed into his arms, cap falling from his head. The boy's breath was shallow, but his smile was wide. Sarah and Ben stood close, Naomi scribbling notes, but John saw only the horse. Rusty lowered his head until his muzzle brushed John's sleeve, steady as always. The board's ruling didn't erase the debts, didn't heal the orchard overnight, didn't cure his son, but it gave them ground to stand on, and sometimes ground was enough. As the crowd dispersed, John whispered to Rusty, "We chose to stay. Now we fight." The horse's breath rolled warm against his arm, and in that moment, the orchard behind them felt less like a ruin and more like a field waiting for rain. Winter eased out of the valley like an old man rising slowly from a chair. The rains had come, not heavy or miraculous, but steady enough to soften the soil and fill the ditches. The orchard, once brittle and gray, now held a faint shimmer of green at the tips of branches. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but John noticed. Every morning he walked the rows with Ethan bundled in a jacket at his side and Rusty trailing behind, the horse's breath clouding the chill air. The hearing's decision had not silenced Richard Hale, but it had given John ground to stand on. Papers had been filed, rights recognized, and while the legal battles would continue, for the first time the orchard wasn't seen as a corpse, but as something worth protecting. Neighbors stopped by more often, bringing tools, spare seed, or just conversation. Sarah lingered with them in the evenings, her laughter carrying through the barn rafters like a sound that belonged there all along. Rusty seemed to change with the land. The scar on his leg remained, the star on his brow still faint, but there was a vitality in him now, a looseness in his gait when he trotted across the pasture. Ethan often leaned against him, cap tilted back, eyes shining as he whispered secrets only the horse could hear. The boy's doctors still spoke cautiously, still measured hope in clinical terms, but John saw more color in his son's cheeks than he had in years. Sometimes Ethan's laughter rose across the orchard, startling birds into flight, and John carried that sound like water in a desert. One morning, just as dawn broke, John stepped out to find the orchard scattered with pink. The first blossoms had opened overnight, soft petals trembling in the cool breeze. He stood still, heart caught in his throat, as if afraid that moving might wake him from a dream. The trees were not all blooming. Not yet, but enough to paint the rose with a fragile promise. Ethan ran to him, breath puffing in the cold. "Dad, look!" He pointed, eyes wide with wonder. Rusty followed, his chestnut coat glowing against the pale blossoms, mane tossing as he tossed his head. The boy reached up to touch a branch heavy with flowers, petals falling into his hair. For a moment, John saw both his son's fragility and his strength. The boy's thin frame anchored by joy no illness could steal. Sarah appeared at the porch, shawl around her shoulders, watching them. Her smile was quiet, not triumphant, but full of recognition. She walked down to join them, slipping her hand into John's without a word. They stood together, watching the orchard breathe again. John reached into his pocket and unfolded the photograph he carried. The faded image of his uncle, standing beside a younger Rusty, decades before. He looked from the photo to the horse before him, the same steady gaze, the same patience etched into dark eyes. Rusty had carried secrets through time, across generations, until the moment came to reveal them. And now, under the blossoming trees, John finally understood. The horse had not only uncovered a secret, he had carried John and Ethan to the place where hope could root again. As the sun climbed higher, petals drifted across the rose like confetti, settling on Rusty's mane, on Ethan's shoulders, on John's weathered hands. John whispered, almost to himself. We stayed. And now it's beginning. Rusty lowered his head, pressing his muzzle against John's arm in quiet agreement. The orchard was still far from saved. Debt remained, Hale's shadow lingered, and the fight was not done. But in that moment, surrounded by blossoms, John no longer felt crushed by what lay ahead. He felt grounded, connected, alive. He looked at Ethan, who laughed as Rusty nudged him playfully, and Sarah, who stood steady beside him. For the first time in years, John allowed himself to believe, not in miracles, but in seasons. Seasons that ended, and seasons that began again. The horse lifted his head to the wind, petals swirling around him, and the orchard seemed to breathe with him. The season of blossoms had come not as salvation, but as a promise that even in broken ground, life can return. And now I want to hear from you. Would you have sold the orchard or chosen to stay? If you felt the heartbeat of this story, just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments so I know you were here. Don't forget to subscribe, because the next stories will take you even deeper into the bonds between people and horses. Stories of hope, loss, and the quiet miracles that change lives.